Hi everyone, welcome back. Great to see you. Today we're going to cover Chapter 6 in our Foundations of Teaching our ELLs. Chapter 6 covers assessment. Within this chapter we're going to talk about pre-assessment, we're going to talk about formative, summative assessment. We'll also cover a little bit about accommodations, because our ELLs in New York State they're all required to take the state tests starting in grade 3 going all the way up to grade 12. So we want to talk a little bit about how we handle that when the proficiency levels aren't quite up to the idea that they're able to sit through a 3-hour standardized test. We'll begin with the difference between testing and assessment, and then it comes in an evaluation. So if you're following along in my additions, page 119. But the idea of the difference between a test and an assessment, a test really measures and is looking at one particular aspect, where when we assess our students, it's a broader idea. We're looking at the idea of reading, writing, speaking, and listening skills on an assessment. It jumps over to evaluation, and evaluation is using the assessment to see whether or not the program goals are appropriate, to see if the materials are appropriate, so we can evaluate what's going on with the student while we look at that assessment. And occasionally you'll pull out that particular test, like a spelling test that may have measured a particular skill. The chapter continues to talk about and introduce summative and formative assessment. In a lesson plan required by New York State, you do have to address pre-assessment as well as formative and summative. Pre-assessment simply can be, and when we think about teaching our students, and let's just look at an elementary classroom, you may have, let's say, first or second or third graders in a group in emerging English language proficiency, and you're reading a book. And let's say the book is the book Hungry Little Caterpillar. That's Eric Carle, I think. And you know the book. It's like By the Light of the Moon, the caterpillar, the cocoon's on the leaf, and he comes out, and on day 1 he eats an apple, day 2 he eats 2 pears, and then like Wednesday he eats 3 plums, and then by Thursday, Friday, and Saturday he's eating pizza and pie, and yada yada yada. So pre-assessment, simply when you're sitting with those students at the beginning, is you could just ask them, what do they know about a caterpillar? Do they know what a butterfly is? Have they ever seen a butterfly? Could they describe it? And that's a little bit the idea that we want to know where our students are, what type of knowledge they have at this beginning of the lesson. As the lesson continues, then we're introduced to formative assessment. What are they understanding? When you're teaching, we want to make sure that our students are really following along and they're understanding what we're teaching. So through formative assessment, it doesn't matter what grade, whether it's kindergarten or here in college. Normally, when you're in class, you have a lecture, a professor or teacher, we ask questions. What happened here? Did you understand this? Or can you follow along here? This is formative assessment. You walk around the classroom, you see how students are doing. If we break you up in groups, again, whether it's in a first grade classroom or college, we walk around, we look at these groups, we check in. This formative assessment. We're forming our assessment throughout the lesson, checking in, making sure the students are getting the material. We might sometimes have to add something in. Summative assessment is merely the end of the lesson or the time period. What have students learned? Have they learned this target? And usually a summative assessment you can see is obviously in a test. It could be a type of graphic organizer, could be an essay, could just be questions and answer. But that summative assessment is the final assessment. You're going to see this all over your CST tests. For those of you taking the test for public school certification, they're going to ask you, why is pre-assessment important? Why is formative assessment important? And what's the purpose of summative? So be sure that you understand these ideas and you understand the difference and why they're important. The chapter covers norm referenced and criterion referenced tests. This is not applicable for you right now. If you eventually go on to get your PhD and you look at types of testing, this will become important in research. But for the most part, most of you, our curriculum includes the activities and graphic organizers and questions and answers and even tests. So for the most part, you're covered in reliability and validity. Read it, just become familiar with the terms. But it's something that for the most part you won't come across. It does talk about a little bit of bias. For those of you who were in 185, we talked a lot about bias in testing, bias in teaching. This reviews a little bit of bias. Again, we see, especially in standardized testing, that these questions, there is a lot of bias that comes out and stereotyping and assuming that students have an idea of what these questions ask, and they're really not fair for all students across the across all types of diversity. It's something that we know, but sometimes when it's required and it's a New York State standard and you're in your classroom and the principal comes and says, you have to sit down, these students have to take these tests, these are things we just have to be aware of, even though right now we don't have too much control. Okay, so we also want to look at accommodations for English language learners. When you have these standardized tests, in New York State they begin in grade 3, you have the ELA and you have a math test. Our ELLs are permitted accommodations, and depending on their proficiency level, until they get commanding, they have accommodations. They may have extra time, they may have a separate space. You want to make sure that you are communicating with your principal and maybe your English chair, if you have an ESL chair. I don't know how big the school would be that you would be teaching in, but you want to make sure that your students get all the accommodations that they're permitted, because second language learners, especially when it comes to that processing time and production time with a time test like a state test, they need those accommodations. So you want to make sure that you understand this idea of accommodations. It's not making the test easier, it's providing a fair platform for all students. Okay, let's see. We talk about performance assessment, which is a type of observation that students are asked to perform a task. We do this often in college. If we weren't in the pandemic right now, all of you would be able to teach a lesson, do a demonstration for us. That's a performance assessment. And that's really common, especially for our ELLs, because we want them to get up, we want them to be talking, to be listening, to really be engaged in activity, not just to be sitting there and quietly doing seat work. So performance activities and performance assessment becomes something that's really important in all the classrooms across the grade level. Self-assessment and peer assessment, again, they talk a little bit about that, is you get to really, how did I do in this type of activity? And then you get to assess your peer. That's sometimes really hard depending on the cultures we have in our classroom. Some cultures are not comfortable assessing a peer. Other cultures, they absolutely love it. So again, we want to be aware of our students' cultural issues that may interfere with peer assessment. Let's see, portfolio assessment, that's becoming more and more common. Rather than just having a final test, an exam, or a paper, the portfolio collects materials the students have created throughout a period of time, whether it's a quarter, a semester, an entire year. That way we have an idea, because we could see the growth of the learner. So we see not only the breadth, but we see the depth of the learner. So just make sure that you get familiar with the idea of portfolio assessment. Also, this talks about need for multiple measures. This comes up on page 144, that we want to make sure that we have strong evidence of a student's knowledge and learning. So if you have multiple measures, and that comes in that portfolio, we have maybe a writing assignment, we have graphic organizers, we have a reading assessment, we maybe have that performance assessment of a video, or at least a rubric on that. Multiple measures gives the teacher a better idea of what the student has learned and where the student's needs are. I think that's it. I think that's it for chapter 6. So make sure that you reread it. Make sure that you know, for those of you getting your certification, make sure you know all the key vocabulary at the end of the chapter. And I'll see you at chapter 7. Bye.